A total of 346 people died when Lion Air Flight 610 went down in October, and in that Ethiopian Airlines crash this past March. It took until May, but President Trump eventually ordered the 737 MAX grounded while the Federal Aviation Agency figures out what went wrong. 6 months to the day after that March crash, victims' family members met with U.S. Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao here in Washington. They told the media that while Chao vowed MAX would not fly again until they were certain it was safe, they say she stopped short of committing to let various investigations play out first. As he was recently sworn into office, Federal Aviation Administrator Stephen Dixon was more committal, vowing that this plane will not fly in commercial service until I am completely assured that it is safe to do so. FAA is following no timeline in returning the aircraft to service. Rather, we are going where the facts lead us and diligently ensuring that all technology and training is present and correct before the plane returns to passenger service. Although MAX only represents 5% of its fleet, Southwest Airlines flies more of them than any other carrier. And after earlier removing MAX from the schedule through November 5, they have now extended to January 5. But that is shallow consolation to those families who lost loved ones in those crashes. Can you imagine how they feel? Our next guest can. Jamie Finch is former director for Office of Government, Public, and Family Affairs at the National Transportation Safety Board. Jamie, your former title says it all. Too often when we hear National Transportation Safety Board in the news, it's after real bad news. And after seeing those families go through what they go through, it must be so frustrating if you have seen this coming. Boeing has a reputation for hubris here in Washington. Well-earned and well-funded, correct?
That is correct. I mean, Boeing is an 800-pound gorilla, if you will, in this town, and has been lobbying up and lawyering up since these crashes have occurred, and the ongoing investigation is happening. What has been the most disconcerting concerning for me and many other people about this has been the fact that they have been pointing their fingers at other people all the time and constantly, rather than kind of doing a more of a self-analysis and being quiet while the investigation is going on and taking process.
Well, to that point, Jamie, too often when things go wrong, it's because the government let the fox guard the hen house. Is Boeing one of these companies that runs amok with self-inspection and other authority?
Well, the entire process where self-certification was allowed by the FAA was always very tenuous. And in this particular situation, the public trust in this type of dynamic was broken, and it was always very, very delicate. Both sides, both the government and the public sector private sector had to be very, very careful and honest and forthright as they went through this self-certification process, because the FAA, quite frankly, does not have the wherewithal, the financial means and technical expertise to be able to keep up with the technology like Boeing or some of the other aviation manufacturers. What this situation has caused, not just a problem for Boeing, it's caused a problem for the entire aviation industry, which has been allowed to self-certify these types of new types of equipment and new pieces that they're designing, and that's caused a big rift within the industry itself at Boeing, because they're very frustrated with Boeing and angry with Boeing because they are actually putting their own self-certification process in jeopardy.
And the government is just too small and the industry is just too big for the oversight it requires, huh?
Correct. That's correct.
Well, politicians love to rail against big government, and candidate Trump promised to cut 2 regulations for every new one. Is the airline industry in general underregulated?
No, I would say that in general, the aviation industry is one of the most regulated industries, as well as should. When you're flying people at 35,000 feet in the air at 500 plus miles per hour to their destinations, which has become commonplace. But obviously, when you start looking at it, that's what you're doing. You need it to be extremely regulated. You would not want corporations to start cutting corners in safety, and so that's why regulations are so important now. With that, the aviation industry with Boeing, this self-certification thing has put all of that in question.
Jamie, you're one of the few people I know who flies as much as I do. Yes. When Max flies again, would you fly on one?
Well, once the planes have been completely certified, both here in the U.S. and also tested by the Europeans and also the Indians and other authorities around the world, they're saying that they also want to do their own certification. I think that we'll be fine. Boeing is an excellent company. I want to be very clear. They have always been an excellent company. They're one of the flagship companies of the United States. They have run into some hiccups with this one particular design, and they're going to have to hash this out and find out why this problem existed for them in their leadership. And because this cascades down, this doesn't start on the shop floor. This starts at the top down. Gotcha. And so we'll see how this all plays out.
Thank you, former NTSB official Jamie Finch.
You're very welcome.
For the cockpit perspective, let's bring in John Jordan, a pilot who has logged over 10,000 hours up there. He's a FAA-certified flight instructor. And John, as a flight instructor, are you horrified that Boeing reckons pilots can learn the MCAS system and other 737 MAX how-to on iPads?
No, I'm not. So much of the actual training is done in a simulator. For some of these subsystems and for some of the academic portions, in the old days it was done with books, now it's done with iPads. The MCAS system, in terms of what pilots need to know to be safe, is fairly simple, and this is a supplement to their regular simulator training, just specifically with regard to the MCAS. So I don't think it's certainly not out of the ordinary.
We think of the sim as a video game, but it's pretty serious stuff. And years ago, I met a NASA astronaut at an event here in Washington, and I asked him, what was your biggest surprise up there? And without hesitation, he answered how few surprises there were because, in his words, the simulator was that good. How challenging are the curveballs that the airlines throw at pilots during these periodic simulator times?
Well, I have to go in the simulator, too, for my airplanes that I fly. And the simulators are great teaching tools because they can do things, you can do things in them that are unsafe in a real airplane, that are truly dangerous. And if a pilot messes up, it can be frozen and backed up and discussed. So it's a far, far better teaching tool. Now, for airlines across the world, as well as corporate jets, entire certification for captains can happen in a simulator. And when you're sitting in there, it is really hard to tell that you are not in a real airplane. It's that realistic. But as a teaching tool, it allows you to do some really, really dangerous things and complicated things and freeze it and back it up that you couldn't do in a real airplane.
So literally, the first time a captain flies a type could be the first time he's flown the type. Other than that, he just checked out in the sim, huh?
It could be that way. It's certainly legal to do it that way. I've done it, and it was the same experience that you just talked to, how few surprises there were and how easy the real airplane is. Now, the training curriculum, to answer your question, the training curriculum that has to, for recurrent and initial training, is very realistic. It's the product of decades of experience and numerous accidents and different incidents being incorporated into these curricula. I think that the FAA wants to go and should continue to go further in the direction of having it be more scenario-based and in terms of different accidents and more realistic in terms of heightening pilots' decision-making rather than just ensuring that they have, in a very predictable way, these very, very high-end and sharp skills in certain emergency situations. So I think it needs to be supplemented with some decision-making exercises.
Are airplanes too automated now?
They can. It depends on the manufacturer. Airbus, for example, that big accident with the Air France 447 off of Brazil happened because they'd gone away from the traditional yokes type steering wheel where one pilot moved it and the other pilot saw it to the side sticks where they could be moved independently. And it was off to the side, and so one pilot couldn't see what the other one was doing, and there was no tactile feedback. And so that was a case of automation taking a perfectly good airplane, in this case Airbus, from altitude all the way into the ocean and killing a whole whole bunch of people. Pilots have to be trained to fly airplanes. One of the unfortunate things modernly is pilots don't actually use their stick and rudder skills as much as they should. So some of those skills fall into disarray. So repeated emphasis on hand flying an airplane and disregarding the automation would also be a benefit to the flying public.
The pilots aboard that ill-fated Ethiopian flight, it came out afterwards, were reportedly really inexperienced. Do we need to wonder if crews flying domestic USA flights are green, or if they're unfamiliar with hardware and software updates?
Well, in the United States, we are still very much the gold standard of aviation training. The pilots flying airliners in the United States, a lot of them are ex-military, even the first officers, and the hours requirements and the training requirements are very, very stringent in this country. Now, when you get to some other countries, to some lower budget airlines that aren't subjected to the U.S. regulatory scheme and to the U.S. Legal requirement, remember, these companies have to be insured and their fear of lawyers and all that, which even heightens the standard in this country. Sometimes you can get like what happened in Ethiopia and Indonesia, pilots with only a few hundred hours, where in this country that would just be unthinkable even to be a co-pilot on a small corporate jet.
I've got less than a minute, but I must ask the short version, and I know you have a story. I've seen the movie Sully at least 4 times. What is the scariest thing that ever happened to you up there?
Well, the scariest thing to me, and I think any flight instructor would agree with this, is when you're teaching people to fly, especially in some of the intermediate stages, after they've learned a little bit to be dangerous, and you're teaching them takeoffs and landings and crosswinds. You never underestimate a human's ability to try to kill you, even inadvertently. So basically, all of my scary times has been teaching. Yeah,
that dancing crab in the crosswind always gets me. John Jordan, thank you for stepping into the big picture. And thank you for watching The Big Picture. If you see us somewhere else, you can now also find RT America live at youtube.com/RT America. And on DirecTV, we are channel 321. We're live on the super cool Pluto TV app. They moved us to channel 279. And on Dish, we're 280. And all of our shows are available anytime, anywhere, on any device at youtube.com/TheBigPictureRT. I'm Holland Cooke in Washington, and at Holland Cooke on Twitter, where if you follow me, I'll follow you. Question more.